Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 18, yes, verse 9. Upavarnitam metadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata Upavarnitam metadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata Upavarnitam metadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata Upavarnitam etadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata Upavarnitam etadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata Upavarnitam etadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata. Mataji's. Upavarnitam etadvaha punyam parikshitam maya Vasudeva kathopetam akyanam yadaprichata. Okay. Upavarnitam. Almost everything described. Etat. All these. Vaha. Unto you. Punyam. Pious. Parikshitam. About Maharaj Parikshit. Maya. By me. Vasudeva. Of Lord Krishna. Katha. Narrations. Upetam. In connection with. Akyanam. Statements. Yat. What? Aprichata. You asked from me. Translation. O sages, as you did ask me, now I have described almost everything regarding the narrations about Lord Krishna in connection with the history of the pious Maharaj Parikshit. Purport. Srimad Bhagavatam is the history of the activities of the Lord, and the activities of the Lord are performed in relation with the devotees of the Lord. Therefore, the history of the devotees is not different from the history of Lord Krishna's activities. A devotee of the Lord regards both the activities of the Lord and those of his pure devotees on an equal level, for they are all transcendental. Again, the translation. O sages, as you did ask me, now I have described almost everything regarding the narrations about Lord Krishna in connection with the history of the pious Maharaj Parikshit. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaha Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Neham Shri Guroho Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupan Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gora Tvishe Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm just thinking the same thing I thought last week, but I didn't say it. I feel very bold, maybe a bit inappropriate to be speaking in front of so many qualified people when I'm not that qualified, but please bless me and forgive me for my attempt to speak in front of you all. So we've just read now we've just read and we've heard about the answering of certain inquiries. And this reminded me of earlier in the first canto of Bhagavatam, we hear the narration of how Dharma personified as a bull was being beaten by Kali Maharaj. And it was obviously a bit of a point of confusion for the sages at Naimisharanya why that Kali Maharaj wasn't immediately killed. And they asked a question and they laid it out. How could such a thing happen? Why would such a thing happen with a great amount of curiosity? And a valid curiosity. And of course, it's not an inquiry that should be discouraged necessarily. But after asking it, they say, Tat Katyatam Mahabhaga. They say, oh, Blessed One, please speak on this question, but only on one condition. They say, Yadi. If and only if, Krishna Katha Shrayam, if it is relevant, if it pertains to Krishna Katha. I found that a really instructive and nice detail, that even something that would seem rather pertinent, if it has no relation to Krishna Katha, we shouldn't really bother to hear it. All discourse has value by being of that transcendental sound. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he writes on the potency of Harikatha, and he says, Harikatha, when spoken by a person Bhagavat, is transcendental sound and is not like material sound. And the distinction between the two is that when material sound enters the mind, material sound, it undergoes the material processes and then produces further material thoughts, which are always, in some extent, limited or faulty. But when transcendental sound enters the mind, rather than going under material processes, it actually clears the way. It does not undergo these processes and instead vacates away and destroys false conceptions. And then having cleared that space, it plants in the true conceptions, what is actually of value. And he speaks and he says, this hearing of Krishna Katha allows one to penetrate further than the sensory abilities of the eyes. It lets us, so to speak, look past the screen of Maya and hear behind the screen to what is beyond. And then he finishes by saying a similar point, echoing that sentiment. He says, we should encourage all of our friends, all the people we know who who by the need to provide for themselves some necessary material things have been captivated by those things and see no point to their life beyond the cultivation of material knowledge. We should encourage them, therefore, to hear things which are Krishna Katha Shrayam, which are carrying that transcendental Hari Katha, because only by that can those material conceptions be destroyed. And so we hear in this purport, Srila Prabhupada discusses in regards to Krishna Katha, as we hear, Vasudeva Katha. He discusses Srimad Bhagavatam. And of course, Srimad Bhagavatam is a very special text. And I remember a story, my spiritual master, His Holiness Radhagovinda Maharaj, he says from the Padma Purana, and he speaks about Narad Muni. So Narad Muni was traveling around doing as Narad Muni does. I remember there's an old song, I was listening to some old ISKCON tapes, and they used to have those songs with the guitars and all, and there was one, Narada Muni, and they'd sing about the transcendental spaceman. And I remember I was listening and they were discussing why they liked this song, and they said obviously it was the 60s and all, and they'd all grown up watching Star Trek, and they really vibed this sort of feeling of somebody traveling around here and there, all sorts of cosmic places. So Narad Muni is traveling as he does, and he ends up in Vrindavan. And in Vrindavan Dham, he sees this beautiful, beautiful woman and these two aged men right next to her. And his curiosity is piqued. He's wondering what's going on here. And he also sees these wonderful little sort of sweet girls who are also beautiful next to this wonderful, beautiful woman. And he goes up and he asks her, he says, what are you doing here? Who are these two old men who are breathing their last breaths right next to you? And upon seeing Narad Muni, this beautiful woman, she says, oh, it is surely good fortune that has arisen now that I've seen a sadhu. Finally, maybe you can help me. And Narad Muni says, well, what was your problem? What was the big issue that I can help resolve? And she says, well, I was born in South India, in Karnataka. I am Bhakti Devi. And these are my two sons, actually. They might not seem like it now because I'm so youthful and they are very old. But these are my two sons, Vairagya and Jnana. And here, all these little ladies are the Tirthas, head by Jamuna Devi and Ganga Devi. And Narad Muni now is very confused, and he says, well, how did you end up in this condition? And she says, well, life was good in South India. Just interesting to note, Karnataka is also where Madhvacharya was born. I don't know if there's a connection, but I was just trying to think about why it says in the Padma Purana that Bhakti Devi was born there. And she says, life was good, but I thought as I was aging, maybe I should head out to Vrindavan Dham for the final, say, pastimes of my life, so to speak. In my mature age, I should retire to Vrindavan. And then so she travels, and as she goes along, she goes through the different states, and she ends up in Gujarat. And in Gujarat, unfortunately, she feels very afflicted, at least in the times of when this pastime was happening. Gujarat was not a very nice place for Bhakti Devi, Jnana, or Vairagya to dwell. And so they decayed away. And they were in very sickly condition, and they were worried for their trip, so they hurried to the last stretch to reach to Vrindavan Dham. And arriving in Vrindavan Dham, Bhakti Devi, she had a glow-up of beauty again. She felt her youth revive. And her two sons, who were on their deathbed before, were maybe breathing a little better, but they were still in rather poor condition. And Narad Muni, hearing this, he says, well, I understand. Of course, you're replenished. When you go to Vrindavan Dham, everyone cares for bhakti. Everyone is so crazily running after bhakti. Vairagya and Jnana, they're sort of, they've been brought up a tiny bit because maybe as a side effect of bhakti in Vrindavan, people will cultivate a tiny bit of Jnana and Vairagya. But really, no one cares too much for them in Vrindavan. Everyone wants bhakti. So he says, but don't worry. He said, if I cannot make sure that Jnana and Vairagya come together, then I am not a devotee. I am no one. This is my promise to you. And he says, the reason why you're so neglected is we've entered Kali Yuga. And in Kali Yuga, things are not as they should be. remember Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he used to do these theistic dioramas, these festivals. That was a main form of outreach that he liked to do, and they attracted many people. So there'd be all those sort of like, I don't think they were animatronics, but like displays, like those sort of animatronic style displays, I don't know. And I think in ISKCON Kolkata you can see they have some of their own modern take on that, if you will. And he would do those, and he came under controversy at one point because he had this one where there was a Brahmin with a Brahminical thread. And he held I think it was a salagram shila, it was some sort of a shila, and he was using it to crack open a nut. He was using it as a nutcracker. And so they brought to the courts, they said, because obviously the implication of this was that the Brahmins were using the great Vedic traditions and all of the forms of worship that they were trained to do just in order to provide a meal for themselves. They were doing it in such a manner. And so this case was brought to the court, and the courts were sort of dishing it out. And back in the day, you could bring those sort of things to the court, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was saying, well, it's true. You can't, I'm just pointing out what's true. And then the Brahmins who brought up an issue with this, they said, well, you know, you're slandering us, and it's not like your Gauriya Vaishnav Brahmins are any better. And then Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says, okay, then we'll put Vaishnav Tilak on it and we'll call it a day. So he put Vaishnav Tilak on this diorama, and then it was all fine. He said, I'm more than happy to criticize the bogus Brahmins or bogus spiritualists, even within my own tradition. It is not that I'm picking on Brahmins, I'm picking on the hypocrisy that we see dwelling throughout Kali Yuga. So because of this, the condition is poor. And Narad Muni then, so he explains this, and Bhakti Devi, she says, well, I've heard that Parikshit Maharaj could have killed Kali Maharaj, but he didn't. He could have stopped this all. And then Narad Muni says, but Parikshit Maharaj saw that under the influence of Kali Yuga, the Sankirtan movement will be spread. And therefore, that was one of the reasons, beyond his Kshatriya dharma, one of the greater reasons he saw in sparing Kali Maharaj and sort of just banishing him out, was that then, by this degraded condition of society, the Sankirtan movement could therefore be spread around. And then she's somewhat satisfied. And then he says, but never worry. Still, nevertheless, I will try and help your sons. So he sits down next to them and he recites to them. He thinks, well, what is the greatest way to cultivate Jnana and Vairagya than the Vedas? So he speaks Vedanta Sutra. He speaks the Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda, Tharva Veda. He speaks the Upanishads. He speaks all the other Puranas. He speaks Bhagavad Gita. He speaks all these things. And maybe they sort of dozed in and out of their comatose state. Maybe they rolled their eyes a little looking around what was happening. But as it stood, nothing happened. And Narad Muni was sort of thinking, well, now what do? I've recited all of the Vedic knowledge to these two boys who were not looking like boys at the time. What can I do? And then suddenly an Akashvani speaks. And it says, you should seek out the sadhus and they will help you. They will help you to understand the solution to this issue. Narad Muni thinks, which sadhus can I go to? And he's sitting there and he's thinking, and then he thinks, the four Kumaras, there's a good shot. So going along, traveling, he goes to the four Kumaras and he speaks to them. And the four Kumaras, and he explains his whole issue, and he says, you know, I even spoke Bhagavad Gita, you know, Sarva Dharman Parityaja, everything. I spoke to them, and yet nothing happened. Maybe a tiny bit of help. And then they told him, they said, oh, we've got a solution. There is a special yagya you can do. It is a yagya of jnana. And when you do this yagya, all benefit in the world will come. All sins will be wiped away. Anyone who even hears this and hears it properly with the right mood will have all the sins emptied from their body. This yagya is the speaking of Srimad Bhagavatam. It is Bhagavad Gita. And so they go back and forth. But then Narad Muni says, but you know, I've heard of Srimad Bhagavatam. It's the essence of all the Vedas. But I've spoken all the Vedas. If I hadn't already spoken all the Vedas before, how's speaking the essence of it after going to be? Yes, maybe Bhagavatam contains all that's worth, all of value from all these other books, but I've already spoken all these other books. What more could it add? And the four Kumaras tell him, they say, just in the same way that maybe ghee is present in milk, but needs to be churned out. In the same way that sugar is present in sugar cane, but needs to be processed out. In the same way, Srimad Bhagavatam, it's maybe the essence of the Vedas, but it needs to be churned out. And once churned out, it is greater than the sum of all of its many factors. So Bhagavatam is not only containing the essence of all the other Vedas, but does so in a way that is sweeter and beyond all of them combined as a sum product. And then hearing that, Narad Muni, he says, well, I'm convinced. And then he speaks Bhagavad Gita. And then at that moment, Bhakti Devi and her two sons, Vairagya and Jnana, they disappear from Vrindavan Dham and they appear right there with the four Kumaras and Narad Dev, and they're refreshed. Jnana and Vairagya have returned to their beautiful condition. Bhakti Devi, beautiful as she was before, is even more immaculately beautiful. And she tells Narad Muni, thank you so much. I knew a devotee would be able to help me. And then she says, now what should I do? And Narad Muni, actually no, not Narad Muni, the four Kumaras, they tell her, now that you're restored, you should remember the promise you made to Krishna. And anytime Srimad Bhagavatam is spoken, anytime the devotees are present and they're speaking katha, you, Bhakti Devi, should enter into their hearts. And that is where you should dwell now. She said, Vrindavan didn't do it for me. Gujarat definitely didn't do it for me. South India was also not doing it for me. So where should I dwell? And the four Kumaras say, in the hearts of the devotees who are hearing Bhagavad Gita. So such is the glories of Srimad Bhagavatam. And Bhagavatam is very important and it's very interesting. It's supported throughout all the Vedas, the authority it has. There's a verse, and this is a bit classic. When you read sort of any sort of argument that's being made, often you'll hear verses are quoted and there's no actual, people don't know where it came from, but they're accepted as part of the Vedic corpus. Even if we can't necessarily find them, we know that they're well established by many acharyas. And so there's this one verse, and it describes that there is one supreme shastra called Srimad Bhagavatam, and it has a few features. And there's some debate over these features. So the features are that there's quite a few, but one is that there's Brahma Vidya spoken by Hayagriva. Another is that it is a commentary on the Gayatri Mantra. Another is that it is 18,000 verses separated into 12 cantos. And another, funnily enough, is that it includes the slaying of the Vritrasura demon. And of course, these are gone through. And one of the main candidates that's sort of taken besides Srimad Bhagavatam, some people will say, I remember my uncle, he was, so my family in India, they're Gauriya Vaishnavas, but my uncle, he's become a Shakta, so he was telling me this. And he was saying, actually, these glories are applying to Devi Bhagavatam. It is not Bhagavatam, but Devi Bhagavatam. And this is actually not a very modern idea. It's been around for a long while. In fact, even Jiva Goswami comments and engages with this idea. We can read, there's a wonderful magazine called Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya, run by Madhavananda Prabhu. And they published a little section on this, and it was really interesting. And they said, well, first of all, there's the fact that it's a commentary in the Gayatri Mantra. And that is a very significant thing. The Gayatri Mantra, as we know, is an evolution of the Om syllable, which is the essence of all the Vedas. And then further on, at least according to His Holiness Bhanu Maharaj, all the Vedas expand out from the Gayatri Mantra. So if one thing is a commentary on the Gayatri Mantra, it is therefore an unpacking of that essence, of that pre-evolute of the whole Vedic corpus. And we read, of course, in the first verse of Bhagavatam, in the opening sort of invocationary prayers, we read the word Dhimahi. It is Dhimahi. And Dhimahi is there, and of course Dhimahi is also in the Gayatri Mantra, and it's understood that this is an unpacking. And in the proponents of the Devi Bhagavad view will say, oh, we have the word Dhimahi, and we also have a few others in our invocation. But Jiva Goswami says you might have the specific words, but you don't have the specific purport of the Gayatri Mantra. You don't have the specific meanings of it. And of course they can all be found in that invocationary mantra at the beginning. So therefore he dismisses that. Furthermore, there's the issue of the Brahma Vidya. So what they'll say is, well, there is no Hayagriva speaking Brahma Vidya in Srimad Bhagavatam. But Jiva Goswami says, actually, when we hear Hayagriva there, we should, even though that is a name of Krishna and it is an avatar of Krishna, it's not actually directly referring to him. The Brahma Vidya, and he goes on and explains how Brahma Vidya actually refers to the Narayan Kavacha described in Bhagavatam, so therefore it's present. And this knowledge was actually spoken by the sage Dadichi to the, what's the name there? The two Dr. Devas. Yeah. So he was going to speak to them, and Indradev came down and he said, these guys they're just physicians, and of course in Vedic times doctors were considered not to be such an elevated profession. A little different to today, but still, it wasn't considered as opulent a thing as it was today. So Indradev said, don't speak this transcendental knowledge to them, and if you do, I'll cut your head off. A little bit of a threat. And then they come and they say, okay, it's all right, we still really, really want to know this. So they say, what we'll do is we'll take your head off, we'll put the head of a horse on, then you can speak to us, and then after speaking to us, Indradev will cut off your head and we'll put back on your normal head. So that's our solution. So in that sense, it was Hayagriva who was speaking the Brahma Vidya, and that Brahma Vidya is therefore contained in Srimad Bhagavatam. So that's another issue addressed. And another interesting thing, I was reading this actually in a mundane sort of academic journal. I was just reading for one of my essays on Srimad Bhagavatam, and there was this debate even in academic circles today. You'll still find some scholars who defend the view that no, the Bhagavatam spoken of in the Vedas is the Devi Bhagavatam. And Edwin Bryant, who's one of the leading Indologists, so to speak, in the academic field, he completely rips this view apart. And an interesting point he makes is the Devi Bhagavat is constantly saying that Srimad Bhagavatam, believed by the Vaishnavas, isn't the real Bhagavatam. But Srimad Bhagavatam never mentions the Devi Bhagavatam, really. And so it's that sort of logic that Prabhupada says when the thief is in the house and then he sees the owner and he says, thief. If one person is so considered, if one text is so obsessed with dismissing the others, and the other one doesn't even really note it, it's very likely that the one that doesn't really bother to assert its dominance in comparison to the other is more likely to be the valid one. Not, of course, that scholars are a valid source of knowledge for Bhagavatam. I was reading that same article, and later on they were talking about the history of dating the Srimad Bhagavatam. And originally in the really revered field of Indology, they said Bhagavatam was written maybe in the 12th century. Maybe it was written then, because Ramanujacharya does not mention it too much in his writings. And if Ramanujacharya, the great Vaishnav, doesn't mention it much, then surely it wasn't around at the time. And then as they keep on going and reading, because they actually hadn't read everything before coming up with their authoritative positions, they found, oh, wait a second, here's some Vaishnav commentators from previous who had mentioned this Srimad Bhagavatam, the same verses and everything. It couldn't be another text. So we'll push it back a few hundred years. We were wrong the first time, but now we know for sure. And then later on, there were these travel documents discovered by I can't remember exactly why he was traveling in India, but he was reporting his travels around India. And this was another few hundred years prior. And then he notes about some text called the Bhagavat Purana. And then the scholars say, okay, it's a few hundred years older now, but now we know for certain that Bhagavatam is only a few hundred years old. And then Edwin Bryant himself has contributed his own contribution to this very certain science of dating the Bhagavatam. And he said, because right now they're saying maybe 10th, 8th, 9th century. And he went and he visited a temple in South India, and he found in the, I don't know what the proper word is, but you know how there's the, they're not full murtis, there's the murals in the walls around in the temples, in those, especially in those Paka South Indian temples. And he was going through and he was looking through and just visiting, and he said, these look familiar. And he said, this is a pastime from the Bhagavatam. This is a pastime from the Bhagavatam. This also is a pastime from Srimad Bhagavatam. And he realized, in fact, this whole thing had all the pastimes of Srimad Bhagavatam in order. Someone might say, oh, it's just a coincidence. These are obviously very popular stories. But how of a coincidence could it be that it has it in the order of all the cantos all throughout the entire temple? And by the dating, or at least the secular dating of this temple, this would be 6th century maybe, 7th century. So for it to have been popular enough that a king had commissioned it to be put on the walls of this temple, it would already have had to have been rather popular. So then he says, maybe it's 5th century. But it keeps going back and back and back. So yeah, whatever salt we can give to the academics, whatever respects they deserve, we'll give it. But I think we'll stick with Srila Prabhupada and all the great Vaishnavacharyas who say it is 5,000 years old. And that is the age of Srimad Bhagavatam. Because I find it interesting, many people get a little disturbed when they read these things because they hear, oh, how could all these scholars, how could they all be wrong? Well, they've been wrong many times. They're probably going to be wrong again. So, yeah. So, we keep on going. And Bhagavatam is, of course, described as the commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. Not in that specific Praman, but it is generally described that way, which is another glory of Srimad Bhagavatam. We know the whole Vedic corpus. We have the 4 Vedas, which are Shruti, so they're never written. They are eternally existing in that form, and they're split up into the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, so forth. And you have your Jnana Kanda and Karma Kanda and Upasana Kanda, and then we have our Smriti Shastra. Smriti Shastra is interesting because I know some people, I was having just a heated discussion maybe with someone regarding the Pancharatra. They were saying we can just dismiss the Pancharatra. And of course, Prabhupada writes, if we dismiss the Pancharatra or the Puranas, because many people say, oh, see the Vedas, the 4 Vedas, they're Shruti, they were never written down. Therefore, they're better than the Smriti, which are written down. But it's written throughout, even in the Upanishads, it's written that the Puranas and the Itihas and all are the sound of the breathing of Vishnu. So obviously they have some divine status, and it's written elsewhere in the Shastras that anyone who practices spiritual life, but not in accordance to the Puranas or the Pancharatra or so on and so forth, is merely a nuisance to society. Srila Prabhupada actually, I thought it was really cool. When I was having this discussion with my friend, I looked it up in the Vedabase, and Srila Prabhupada renders it. He says, in fact, all their spirituality is just a show and nonsense. So, of course, these texts are very relevant and pertinent and not to be dismissed. And yet, we find ourselves finding very many schools built up upon and around the Vedic texts. We have the Mimamsa schools, we have the Nyaya, we have yoga, and so on and so forth. But then we find that in today's age, most of them are gone. And the reason why is because Vedanta has taken a very predominant place. And rightfully so, Vedanta, in one sense, can be rendered the end conclusion of the Vedas. So when you have a text like the Vedanta Sutra or the Brahma Sutras, this would be an encapsulation of the final conclusions of the Vedas. But sutras are very hard to understand. There's a saying, it's a popular saying, that among Sanskritists, Sanskrit composers, they feel greater joy from removing one syllable to abbreviate one of their sutras. They get greater joy from doing that, from only one syllable's reduction, than they do from the birth of any of their sons. That is the great joy they have from writing these concise and impossible to understand aphorisms. So having had written these are very hard to understand. I'm saying when you read them as if I read them. But when you look at them, you'll find that they very much are a product of the Vedic era. They are obviously a text that needs to be unpacked by a teacher. It's not that they were studied in isolation. Obviously, we have today, there's this big idea, I'll just read the scriptures and come up with my own idea. But that does not seem to be the attitude, especially around Vedanta Sutra. It's not a question of scholarship even to understand it. It's just a question of it's so dense and so difficult. It's clearly meant to be just remembered a bit. And then you remember, oh, my guru said this, this, and this. And it's all encapsulated there. And Srimad Bhagavatam is, of course, the commentary on Vedanta Sutra. Suhotra Maharaj does a fantastic, I won't get into it, but he does a fantastic seminar where he actually goes through the whole Vedanta Sutra and he shows every Bhagavatam verse that sort of unpacks each one. And of course we know, well, the first verse of Vedanta Sutra is a generic sort of standard for the genre, but then the first sort of substantial statement is the same that we find in Bhagavatam, it's the Janmadya. It's that one word, it begins Janmadyasya. The same way that Bhagavatam begins, Vedanta Sutra begins as well. So there we find an indication of Bhagavatam being an unpacking of this. And in fact, it's said, I forgot where, I think it's in one of the Puranas maybe, that at one time all of the Vedas, all of the Vedic literature were put on a scale on one side, and the Srimad Bhagavatam was put on the other. And obviously we can know that the Bhagavatam weighed heavier. So then we go on forth and we think, why then is Bhagavatam so amazing? We've heard of its glories, we've heard of its potency. And of course we read that Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of Krishna. Krishna appears among the aquatics as Matsya. He appears among the mammals as Varaha. He appears among the people, among humans as Ramchandra, among the demigods as Vamanadev. And then among books, he appears as Srimad Bhagavatam. And being his literary incarnation, it is transcendental. It is described sometimes as the Paramahamsa Samhita. We know that a Hamsa is a swan, and the opulence of a swan is that it can separate milk from water. And the purport of that, obviously, is that the Hamsa can separate the transcendental milk of spiritual knowledge from the material knowledge of water. But the Paramahamsa is even greater than that. We hear that it is the Paramahamsa Samhita. It is the Samhita for Paramahamsas. So if the Hamsa separates milk from water, the Paramahamsa separates the sweetest of milk from the rest of milk. So the Paramahamsa Samhita is written for those Paramahamsas. It is a separation of all the sweetness in the Vedic literature. And so then, what is the teachings of Bhagavatam? Bhagavatam, of course, is encapsulated in its Paribhasha Sutra of Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. We read after a description of all these various avatars that tu, but Krishna Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna is the Supreme Personality. His Holiness Bhakti Chaitanya Maharaj actually makes a point that there's actually two Paribhash Sutras. We can consider this a Paribhash Sutra, but if this verse was not here, we would consider the Bhagavaniti, Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti, Shabdyate. We can consider that, 1211, I think. We can consider that to actually be an alternate Paribhash Sutra, which I thought was interesting. And His Holiness Mahanidhi Goswami, he writes that actually, that is according to Tattva Prachar, according to the promulgation of philosophical truth. Those two can be considered the Paribhasha Sutra. But according to Rasa Prachar, according to the Rasic Tattva, actually the first verse is to be considered the Paribhasha Sutra because it encapsulates so much rasa. And he sort of unpacks that, but I wanted to go forward. So then we go on forward, and we read in the second verse then of the invocation to Bhagavatam, where Srimad Bhagavatam itself describes itself. We read that it is, where is it? Right here, okay. It is completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated. And this Bhagavata Purana propounds the highest truths, which is understandable by those devotees who are fully pure in heart. So it is rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated. And the word used here in the Sanskrit is Kaitavaha. Kaitava Dharma. Kaitava Dharma is rejected by Srimad Bhagavatam. But what is Kaitava Dharma? When we read in Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's in the first chapter. That's one of the only ones I've read, but no. But we read in there that Kaitava Dharma is defined as the Purusharthas. Cheating dharma, false religiosity, is dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Which is weird, because elsewhere we read that obviously that's the Purushartha, it's the art of the Purush, it's the goal for human life, is the cultivation of any one of those going upwards. But of course the purport of that is that the only that even all, it says a few verses later, even all auspicious activities are actually considered in the darkest of ignorance if they aren't cultivating Krishna Prem. All of these dharmas are cheating dharmas when put in light of the ultimate objective standard of the Vedas. And we read in the 11th canto, there's the, it's one of my favorite verses because it's just really brutal. It says that for morality in the material world is relative. And it is relative in the sense that for some people, no sin is actually sinful because they are so degraded that in the same way as somebody lying on the floor cannot get any lower, they themselves cannot get any lower. And in the purport to that, which is echoing the previous acharyas, in the purport to that it says, all ethics in the material world are relative. For a grihastha to get married is a very good thing. For a sannyasi to do so, not so much. And so because of that, we find material ethics are relative. But relative to what? They're relative to that one objective standard, that one objective focal point, which is, of course, Krishna, devotional service. So in that same sense, all the other shastras, which are outlying all these many things, are in one sense cheating. But they're doing a very nice sort of cheating. They're cheating people away to Krishna Prem. They're saying, you want this, but we're going to progressively cheat you away to the final conclusions of Srimad Bhagavatam. So then, and even when it describes, I know His Holiness Bhakti Vikash Maharaj was once asked, he said, he was giving a class on 5th canto or something like that, or 3rd canto, and it was, very obtuse, very sort of, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was one of those Vedic science sort of things, and somebody asked Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, what does this have to do with devotion? This is so hard to understand. And His Holiness Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, he says it's the logic of the finger pointing to the moon. When other shastras maybe delineate these things, they maybe don't do so directly. But even when Bhagavatam discusses Maya, it does so in the same way that one can say, look at the tree over there and look between its branches. And then see between the branches, you can see the moon. So in the same way, when it describes material nature, it does so only as a runway to then point towards that ultimate conclusion. So because some people might say, well, there's all the 10 features of a normal Purana in there. There seems to be some very Kaitava topics in there, but it's done so in a way that's utilized within that direct relevance. And of course, I find that analogy nice because Krishna, of course, says identifies himself with the moon in the famous I Am series. Okay. So then, with the essence seeking, I find this interesting because I didn't touch on how Bhagavatam is defined as that which describes the pastime of the Vritra demon. Because we find this in many places. One of my friends was telling me it's in Ramayana. It's also in the Rig Veda, so it's very old. It's also in Devi Bhagavat. And when we find it elsewhere in the Vedic corpus, it's describing a very standard demigod. Indra's very, very cool. He's killing the demons, and there's this evil demon, and he gets slayed. And the proponents of the Devi Bhagavat view will say, see, our version aligns with the Rig Veda's version, and the Rig Veda is so opulent and so amazing that therefore our version is the version that's being referred to. Our version of the Vritra Katha is the ultimate one. But actually, I think when one reads Srimad Bhagavatam's account for it, one can find that Bhagavatam's version is clearly superior, and I'll get into the reason why. Obviously, we know the pastime Chitraketu Maharaj, he's flying in his airplane with these celestial damsels, and he sees Shiva giving teaching, giving out knowledge with Parvati on his lap, and Chitraketu Maharaj sort of says, what's going on there? This is the the Jagat Guru, the greatest Vaishnava, and he's here giving katha with, if I sat down with Mataji on my lap, I don't think I'll be able to speak for too long. But then he says that, and then everyone hears, and Shiva's really cool. He just sort of laughs. He laughs it off. But Parvati, she's not so happy. We see this on book distribution sometimes. You'll get a man, he's very interested in taking the book, and then suddenly his wife turns up, and after a chastisement, he's not so interested in getting the book. But, so she's not so happy. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says in his commentary on this pastime, he says actually, because they were both they were both worshippers of Sankarshan, they had a very intimate relationship, actually, Chitraketu and Shiva. And when Shiva was laughing, it was actually a bit of banter. It was a sort of sarcastic response. He was saying, you're pointing this out about me, but here you are making a big show of being a devotee, but you're flying around having fun. Whereas here I am, and I'm openly here with my wife, but internally, I'm actually a pure devotee. So it was a sort of a bit of a jovial exchange. And Chitraketu actually said this out of concern for Shiva. He wanted to curb any potential criticism that might come his way by pointing it out. So it's not to understand that he was actually criticizing. However, Parvati Devi was a bit lost to this import, and therefore she cursed him. And then, you can go on. He's very fine being cursed. He just says, please, just stop being upset with me. That's the only thing I want. So then we go off, new time, new place. Indradev is going on one of his conquests. He's killing lots of demons, very, very cool. And there's one demon, and he's very upset, and he does the yagya. Well, he has a yagya done to have somebody who will slay Indra, and obviously the yagya is not done correctly, and it turns out that demon will be slayed by Indra, which is very unfortunate for him, but very fortunate for the demon, because that demon is Chitraketu, born as Vritrasur. And as they're fighting, him and Indra assembles a special weapon and they're going at it. And at one point, Vritrasur seems to get the upper hand. And I love it in Bhagavatam. It always describes everyone else watching. Everyone gets really scared. Everyone's like, oh no, what's going to happen? Oh, what's going on? And so everyone's really worried. What's going to happen? Vritrasura is winning. And then and Indra, he's sort of like, no, I'm losing. And he gets dejected. And then suddenly we hear from Vritrasura, we hear probably, it's one of my favorite sections of all Bhagavatam, he says this wonderful description. He says, no, I am playing the role of a demon, you're playing the role of the demigod. But why should we think that we have any authority over these? We are just like dolls in the hands of the Supreme Lord. Play your role. This is almost like dice. It is almost like gambling for us, because we can't actually affect anything. Let us just engage in this, do our duty, and fight it out. And then Indra is so inspired by this transcendental knowledge that is spoken that he takes up his weapon and they continue fighting. You know, Vritrasura loses both his arms and he becomes a big sort of snake-like being, which is how he's described in the Rig Veda, as a giant cosmic snake. So that's sort of this correlation. So anyways, and then they fight it out, and then Indradev spends nearly a year cutting off his head, and so on and so forth. And then he's liberated, and just before leaving, he speaks again a few wonderful prayers, and he says, you know, I don't want any opulence, I just want to be around those who serve you, Bhagavan. So we see he's a very pure devotee. And why then would this be, say, the definitive version, the ultimate version of such a pastime? And I think the reason why is because this shows that essence-seeking nature of Srimad Bhagavatam. In Srimad Bhagavatam, we find many sort of things that are not the way they should be. There we saw a demon chastising a demigod. When we open the covers of Srimad Bhagavatam, there's that wonderful picture in the cover. And it has Shukadev speaking, but in the audience are all these senior munis and sages. Vyasadeva even is there, Narad Muni. All these people are there and they're listening to him. But he's just a 16-year-old boy. That is not proper etiquette. But it is the essence-seeking nature that where that transcendental knowledge is found, where that essence is found, everything can sort of be turned around. We hear Bali Maharaj's wife, in Vedic culture, a husband should instruct his wife, but Bali Maharaj's wife conveys the knowledge. She conveys a sort of chastisement to him. And so we hear this throughout. Bhagavatam is a dynamic text. It is there to seek out the essence. And that essence is spoken out. So then we hear. And not just is the book Bhagavat dynamic and not a static thing, but so is the person Bhagavat, and that is what we read in this purport, the glories of the person Bhagavat. The person Bhagavat is also dynamic, and that's why we see in the pastimes of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, so on and so forth, as Srila Prabhupada says, the person Bhagavat is the embodiment of Bhagavatam. It is the person who lives his life completely in accordance with it, and completely in accordance with such a dynamic text, their lives too are dynamic, and that's why we see all of these great innovations that are implemented. So then we see the person Bhagavat is also dynamic and also teaches us. And we know, again, this is the glories of we should hear about the pastimes of the person Bhagavat, because in many sense, the book Bhagavat is sort of like the static manifestation of Bhagavatam. It is in one sense dynamic, but on the other hand, as His Holiness Bhakti Vikash Maharaj often makes this point, he says the book Bhagavat can't pinch your ear when you're doing something wrong, but the person Bhagavat can. And we hear so many pastimes, so many things, like we see Srila Prabhupada, he saw during Ratha Yatra, when everyone else saw a car, he saw a rath that could be used. How can we learn this from a book? But to see it being acted out is so much more relevant to us, and we see the purport of these person Bhagavats manifesting outwards. So these person Bhagavats also then, not that there was any confusion, but I'm not a Bhagavat, but so when I'm speaking, I can only describe Srimad Bhagavatam. But when these person Bhagavats speak, they are speaking Srimad Bhagavatam. And we read in one of the purports, Srila Prabhupada writes, just after the Chatur Shloki is manifested, he writes and he says, one should not think that just because all of Bhagavatam is here in these 4 verses, that the remaining verses have become useless, or that they are in some factor less, because the essence is already there. Bhagavatam is unlimited. And it can never be spread out. The more verses you speak, each one will continue being more and more potent. And then he makes this point that Bhagavatam was first spoken in 4 shlokas, and then it was expanded out further and further and further. And then we read in the opening verses of Srimad Bhagavatam that this Bhagavatam was made even sweeter, this nectar was made even sweeter after passing out from the lips of Shukadev Goswami. And Prabhupada makes this really wonderful point. He says, how can Bhagavatam be equally great as 4 shlokas and as 18,000 verses? Well, Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of Krishna. And Krishna can be smaller than the most small and greater and bigger than the most big, larger than the most large. So in that same way, Bhagavatam has the same potency. So we should hear Bhagavatam. And we should hear Krishna Katha. And Katha of the devotees of Krishna is equal to the Katha of Krishna. I had a few more points. I'm running out of time. But I'll just make a few final points that I had on Krishna Katha. Krishna Katha is, of course, considered very elevated. And I was listening to class by His Grace Madhavananda Prabhu. And he was making this really interesting point. He said, he was speaking about how we have a large infatuation for kirtan in ISKCON today. And he said, one thing we need is as equally a great an infatuation with Krishna Katha. And the praman he goes to is really interesting. He goes to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who said that just Srimati Radharani comes with Krishna whenever Krishna incarnates. When Krishna comes as Ram, obviously as Sita, so on and so forth. When Krishna comes as Nam Prabhu, Srimati Radharani descends as Krishna Katha. Therefore, glorification or chanting of Nam without Krishna Katha is to be considered an imbalanced act. And one might say, but we hear all the glories of the holy name. Surely they're independent. And Madhavananda Prabhu makes this wonderful point. He quotes a tika from Sanatana Goswami. There's this one verse, I don't have time to quickly get it open, but one of the ways to delineate, to take out the meaning of the Sanskrit, is that Bhagavatam is actually the Nama Purana. How can we chant the holy name if we do not understand it? How can we chant the holy name if we do not orient ourselves around it? It is the incarnation of Krishna. And the Bhagavatam is a Nam Purana. It is the utmost way to understand the chanting of the holy name. And so we should go deep in Srimad Bhagavatam. Gaur Govinda Maharaj, he would set a time every morning, I think it was around 3 a.m., where he would read Bhagavatam before chanting or Mangalarti and everything. But every morning he would actually wake up 1 or 2 hours early because he was so excited to read Srimad Bhagavatam every day that he couldn't contain his excitement, and he would just wake up early. And he would say, and the fruits of that were deep. He said, Bhagavatam is like an ocean. If we go shallowly and just dip our feet in it every day, maybe we'll get some fish. But if we go deep inside it, we'll find many jewels. And Srila Prabhupada says this as well. Srila Prabhupada once asked one of his disciples, he said, are you reading Srimad Bhagavatam? Are you studying Srimad Bhagavatam? And his disciple said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. Every day I'm reading Srimad Bhagavatam, at least an hour. And Prabhupada said, it is not enough to just read. You must study Srimad Bhagavatam daily. So then that is the glories of Hari Katha. And just one final point I thought was interesting. I heard in some Katha, Vasudeva and Nanda Baba are the 2 fathers of Krishna. And as we read in 10th canto, there's the 2 Krishnas. There's a Krishna of Dwarka Leela who was born to Vasudeva and Devaki. And then there's the Vraj Leela Krishna. And the Vraj Leela Krishna is considered to be higher. In one sense. He's more complete. Not, of course, to disparage the Krishna born to Devaki, but that is the purport. And the reasoning behind this is we hear the glories of mantra, of meditation on the mantras, which are given by Diksha. Yes, such are the glories of Diksha. And we know that Vasudeva, when he was wanting to have in his family, to have as his son the Supreme Lord, he meditates, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. He meditates like this, and then with that thought, he implants that into the womb of Devaki. By constant meditation on mantra. But it's said of Nanda Maharaj that when they were manifesting the Prakat Leela, Yogamaya obviously covers their knowledge of Krishna. But when you're Nanda Baba and you have the knowledge of Krishna covered up by Yogamaya, you can feel something's missing. So not in a material sense that he wanted a son, but in that spiritual sense that he just had this real deep sense of emptiness. he was worried and he was concerned. He spoke to Jashodama about it, and they were like, I feel this too. And so then every Ekadashi, and this is also the glories of Ekadashi, he would perform a certain vrat. It's a very intense vrat. And with this vrat, he would do, because he knew this is the way I can sort of just find out what's going wrong. Why do I have this profound sense of emptiness? I'm obviously a great devotee of Nrsingadev and Narayan. Why am I feeling this emptiness? And yet every night on Ekadashi, he would see this vision of this beautiful black boy. And he would describe every day to Jashodama after his Ekadashi Vrat. He would say, I saw this beautiful boy with such a wonderful peacock feather. I saw this beautiful boy with such a beautiful flute. He was like this lotus, but the darkest lotus I'd ever seen, and yet somehow that made him all the more beautiful. And speaking this Hari Katha, this Krishna Katha to Jashodama, that desire for this beautiful boy entered into her heart. And with that desire to give birth to him, then she became pregnant with Krishna, with the Vrajalila Krishna. Such is the glories of Hari Katha, that even the greatness of, say, Diksha mantras, even the greatness of, say, Diksha, or the holy name, separate from Krishna Katha, are found somewhat lacking. So that is the opulence of Krishna Katha, that is the opulence of Srimad Bhagavatam. We find in Bhagavatam there's a lot of Katha to be heard. We should hear from the person Bhagavat. Yeah, and that's, I should have come up with a better conclusion. I'd ask for questions, but I think I'm out of time. Okay, Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Oh no.
You have so much to speak.
No, I just...
And have this place. No, seriously. I think you should.
Thank you.
Speak more often.
Yeah, I think I speak enough. Okay, thank you.